The lights dim, the velvet curtains part, and for a moment the world seems to hold its breath. On the silver screen appears a woman whose very presence feels like destiny itself. Sophia Loren. Her name is whispered like a prayer in Italy, sung like a melody in Hollywood, and remembered as the embodiment of timeless beauty across the globe. But behind that dazzling image, behind the golden statuettes and the applause that shook entire theaters, lies a tragedy that deepens with age. At 84, Sophia Loren stands not as the untouchable goddess she once was, but as a fragile woman burdened by the weight of memory, solitude, and the inexorable decline of time. When we speak of Sophia Loren, we do not just speak of a movie star. We speak of an era. Born Sofia Villani Ciccolone in the poverty-stricken town of Pozzuoli, near Naples, in 1934, she rose from hunger and deprivation to the world stage. She knew the taste of war rations, the sound of bombs shaking her childhood walls, the humiliation of being called the toothpick by classmates for her lanky frame. She grew up watching her mother struggle, abandoned by a man who never truly claimed his daughter. For Sophia, the idea of survival was not glamorous. It was raw, desperate, carved into her bones. Perhaps that is why, when the camera later gazed upon her, it captured not just beauty, but resilience, the kind of strength only born from suffering. By the time she was a teenager, Sophia's striking looks began to eclipse the hardships of her youth. Beauty contests and modeling jobs led her to Rome, where destiny came knocking in the form of a man who would change her life forever. Carlo Ponti, a married film producer twice her age. He saw in her not just beauty, but potential, and he placed her on a path that would catapult her into the stratosphere of international stardom. But this mentorship, and eventually their controversial love affair, was both the making and the haunting of Sophia Loren. From the very beginning, her rise to fame was shadowed by whispers, by moral judgments, by scandals that never fully faded. It is the paradox of Sophia Loren. The higher she rose, the more the world seemed eager to remind her of her wounds. In the 1950s and 60s, Sophia conquered Hollywood. Films like Two Women, Marriage, Italian Style, and Yesterday, Today, and Tomorrow turned her into an icon of passion and artistry. She did not just act, she lived every frame. Critics marveled at how her eyes alone could tell an entire story. When she won the Academy Award in 1962 for Two Women, she became the first actor ever to win an Oscar for a performance in a foreign-language film. It was not just a personal victory. It was a victory for Italy, for women who had endured war, for every little girl who believed that tragedy could be transformed into triumph. Yet even in triumph, her heart carried a shadow. The Oscar could not silence the loneliness that often followed her back to empty hotel rooms, nor could it erase the guilt of being called a homewrecker in Italy for her relationship with Ponti, whose divorce took years to resolve, in a country where Catholic law was unforgiving. Sophia Loren's beauty was often described as otherworldly, but she herself confessed to insecurities that no amount of fame could heal. She longed for stability, for motherhood, for a home that would not be shattered by scandal or distance. Her marriage to Carlo Ponti, though eventually legitimized, came at a cost. Years of living in exile from Italy due to bigamy charges, years of fighting for recognition, not just as a star, but as a wife entitled to love. And when she finally became a mother after heartbreaking miscarriages, the world assumed her life was complete. But fate was cruel. The very man who shaped her destiny, Carlo Ponti, the love of her life, was destined to leave her twice, once in exile, and finally, forever, in death. His passing in 2007 left Sophia broken in ways she rarely spoke of. The woman who had once lit up the screen with fierce vitality now retreated from public life, living quietly in Geneva. Her laughter heard less often, her appearances rarer each year. By the time she reached her 80s, Sophia Loren was no longer the radiant goddess draped in Dior gowns, striding past photographers at Cannes. She had become a recluse of sorts, stepping out only for rare interviews or to promote her memoir. The world that once adored her now mourned her absence, whispering that perhaps the loneliness had grown too heavy, that the tragedies she carried had finally stolen the spark from her eyes. For the woman who had once embodied Italy's post-war hope, the silence of her twilight years feels almost unbearable. Her story is no longer about triumphs on the screen, but about the fragility of a legend left to wrestle with the ghosts of her past. And so, as the curtain rises on this chapter of Sophia Loren's life, we are invited not just to marvel at her beauty or her awards, but to ask the haunting question, what becomes of the world's most beautiful woman when the applause fades, when the man who anchored her heart is gone, when the body that once defied gravity begins to betray her? At 84, Sophia Loren's tragedy is not a scandal splashed across tabloids or a downfall crafted by enemies. It is something far more universal, far more heartbreaking. It is the tragedy of time itself. If Sophia Loren's rise was meteoric, it was also entwined with the most controversial love story of her time. Carlo Ponti, a man 22 years her senior, became both her guardian angel and her curse. He recognized her potential when she was barely out of adolescence, signing her to a contract that promised to refine her rough edges and shape her into an international star. For a girl who grew up with bombs falling outside her window and who had been abandoned by her father, Carlo was more than a mentor. He was safety, admiration, and eventually, love. But theirs was not a simple romance, it was a battlefield. In the conservative climate of 1950s Italy, divorce was almost unthinkable. Ponti was married with children, and the Catholic Church's influence ensured that ending that marriage would mean exile, scandal, and perhaps even criminal charges. Yet the connection between Carlo and Sophia was undeniable, and soon their bond became the talk of the press. Italians adored Sophia as their national treasure, but many turned against her when she openly embraced her love for Ponti. She was labeled the other woman, accused of destroying a family, and condemned by the moral codes of her homeland. At one point, charges of bigamy were even brought against Ponti, forcing the couple to marry by proxy in Mexico before fleeing to France, where the law was less suffocating. It was a paradox that followed Sophia throughout her career. Adored by millions for her beauty and talent, yet vilified for her personal life. The photographs of her in dazzling gowns, clutching awards, and smiling for cameras told only half the story. Behind those photographs was a woman constantly looking over her shoulder, torn between her loyalty to the man she loved and the rejection of the country that had given her life. This duality, glamour and grief, passion and punishment, became the fuel that made her screen performances so electrifying. When she portrayed women torn apart by war, betrayal, or forbidden desire, she wasn't merely acting. She was channeling her own reality. Hollywood, however, embraced her with open arms. American directors and audiences saw in Sophia something exotic yet deeply human. She was paired with the greatest leading men of her time: Cary Grant, Frank Sinatra, Clark Gable, and Marcello Mastroianni. With Cary Grant, there was even a real-life spark, a temptation that almost derailed her future with Ponti. Grant reportedly fell deeply in love with her during the filming of The Pride and the Passion in 1957, and proposed marriage more than once. For a young woman barely in her 20s, the allure of Hollywood's most charming man must have been overwhelming. Yet, Sophia chose Carlo, the man who had believed in her before the world did, the man who had endured disgrace to stand by her. It was a choice that defined the rest of her life. A choice of loyalty over glamour, of roots over fleeting desire. The gamble paid off, at least in terms of her career. In 1962, Her role in Two Women stunned audiences and critics alike. Playing Sisera, a mother who tries to protect her daughter during the horrors of World War II, Sophia delivered a performance so raw and harrowing that it shattered the stereotype of her being just another beautiful face. She wept, screamed, and collapsed with the pain of a woman who had lived through hell. And the Academy took notice. When Gregory Peck announced her name at the Oscars, Sophia's victory was historic. She was not just the first actress to win for a foreign-language role, she was the embodiment of resilience itself. For Italy, it was a moment of national pride. For Sophia, it was proof that her scars could be transformed into gold. Yet, even as she stood on the peak of the cinematic world, her private life remained a storm. Carlo's marriage to his first wife dragged through years of legal battles. The Vatican, unwilling to accept divorce, ensured that Sophia's marriage remained unrecognized in Italy until 1966, when Carlo and his wife finally obtained a divorce in France. Even then, the whispers never fully ended. Sophia's devotion to Ponti was unwavering, but it came at a price. Years of exile, years of being judged, years of feeling like she was simultaneously Italy's greatest star and its greatest sinner. She once confessed in interviews that she would have given up Hollywood for the chance to be openly accepted with her husband in her own country. The world may have adored Sophia Loren, but Italy, her birthplace, made her feel like an outcast. Motherhood, too, was a battlefield. Sophia longed for children, but miscarriages left her devastated. Each loss was a wound she carried silently, away from cameras and fans. When she finally gave birth to her two sons, Carlo Jr. and Eduardo, it was after years of heartbreak and medical treatments. The joy of holding her children was profound, but even that came with sacrifice. Hollywood's demands often kept her far from home, and her refusal to uproot her family to Los Angeles meant turning down roles that could have expanded her career even further. For Sophia, being a mother was not an accessory to her stardom. It was the fulfillment of a dream she feared she would never achieve. It grounded her, but it also deepened the contrast between her public image and her private battles. As the decades passed, Sophia Loren became not just a movie star, but a symbol of Italian culture. Every curve of her body, every glance of her eyes was celebrated as the essence of Mediterranean beauty. Fashion designers begged her to wear their creations. Directors begged her to grace their films. And yet, beneath the spotlight, she remained tethered to the man who had once been called her downfall. She and Carlo Ponti built a love story that defied laws, churches, and gossip columns. It was epic in scale, tragic in cost, and enduring in a way that Hollywood rarely allows. But the very love that sustained her career also imprisoned her in a life of exile and scandal. This contradiction, glory on screen, struggle at home, was the defining tragedy of her golden years. By the end of the 1970s, Sophia Loren was no longer just a star, she was a legend. Yet even legends are human. As she looked back on her journey, from the bombed streets of Pozzuoli to the Academy Awards stage, she carried with her the unshakable knowledge that every triumph had been shadowed by sacrifice. The world saw her as the woman who had it all: beauty, fame, love, family. But Sophia knew better. She knew the price of each of those treasures, and it is in that knowledge, in that collision of triumph and loss, that her story takes on its most heartbreaking form. By the time the 1960s reached their zenith, Sophia Loren was no longer just an actress. She was the crown jewel of international cinema. A woman whose silhouette alone could command headlines, whose arrival at a film festival caused photographers to trip over themselves just to capture a fraction of her aura. To the public eye, she had ascended into untouchable royalty, the perfect embodiment of glamour. But with every crown comes a hidden weight, and for Sophia, The glitter of stardom began to disguise the shadows that quietly gathered at the edges of her life. In Hollywood, Sophia Loren represented something rare and intoxicating. She was not the fragile ingenue type so often cast in American films. She was earthy, sensual, intelligent, with a fire in her eyes that could burn through the lens. American audiences, accustomed to polished studio-made beauties, were captivated by her authenticity. On screen, she was at once a goddess and a neighbor, a fantasy and a reality. Films like Houseboat with Cary Grant and El Cid with Charlton Heston reinforced her reputation as the European siren who could hold her own against the most powerful men in cinema. Directors described her as fearless, capable of turning even the most ordinary line into poetry. And yet, for all the glamour, Sophia's success was also an isolating cage. She was constantly in demand, shuffled between continents, exhausted by the endless expectation to be both Italy's pride and Hollywood's jewel. Journalists chased her every move, dissecting her appearance, her diet, and her family life. The very beauty that had rescued her from poverty had become a burden she could never set down. She once admitted that she could not walk down the street without disguising herself for fear of being mobbed by fans or hounded by paparazzi. Every smile, every gesture was scrutinized for cracks in the facade, and beneath that scrutiny, Sophia often felt like a prisoner in her own legend. The marriage to Carlo Ponti, though deeply devoted, remained a source of relentless controversy. Even after their union was finally legitimized in the mid-1960s, the whispers never died. For years, the Vatican had branded them outlaws. Newspapers described them as fugitives of morality. Even as she basked in the glow of awards and box office triumphs, Sophia endured the sting of being judged not for her talent, but for her choices as a woman in love. In her heart, she knew she had chosen loyalty, but the world saw only scandal. That contradiction bled into her performances. Her characters in films often carried a melancholy, a wounded strength that mirrored her own struggles. Audiences wept with her not just because of her acting, but because they sensed the truth that lay beneath it. As the 1970s approached, Loren's life reached a peculiar crossroads. She was still adored worldwide, yet the industry that once crowned her began shifting its gaze. Younger stars emerged, new trends in cinema demanded different kinds of heroines, and Sophia, now in her 40s, faced the brutal reality of Hollywood's obsession with youth. Offers became less frequent, and roles less luminous. For an actress who had given her soul to the screen, the fading spotlight felt like a betrayal. The very same critics who once hailed her as a revelation began to whisper about her age, about whether her beauty was waning. And Sophia, though still regal, carried the quiet sorrow of someone being gently pushed aside by the very stage she helped build. It was during this time that personal tragedy struck with greater force. Her miscarriages, years earlier, had already etched scars into her heart. Even after the joy of having her 2 sons, she continued to wrestle with the fear of losing them, of being robbed again by fate. Carlo's health, too, began to decline, reminding Sophia that even love was not eternal. The home she had built first in exile, later in Switzerland, was filled with warmth. Yet it often felt like a fortress, designed to protect her from a world that no longer adored her with the same fever. Behind the tall gates of her Geneva villa, Sophia became more reclusive, choosing privacy over public appearances. The goddess was withdrawing, not because she had nothing left to give, but because the world had begun to look away. Yet even in retreat, her legacy remained untouchable. Fashion houses still begged for her presence. Film festivals still honored her. Young actresses looked at her as the template of everything they wished to be: bold, magnetic, immortal. But Sophia knew better. She knew that immortality was an illusion, that every ovation is followed by silence, that every spotlight eventually fades into darkness. In interviews, she began to speak less about her films and more about her family, about cooking, about the ordinary joys she had missed during her whirlwind youth. To the public, it seemed as though she had gracefully accepted aging, but those close to her whispered that she still carried profound sadness. For Sophia, growing older was not simply about wrinkles or fading beauty. It was about watching the world move on without her. Perhaps the most haunting part of Sophia Loren's tragedy is that it was not born of scandal or destruction, as so many Hollywood tales are, but of inevitability. Time itself became her adversary. The body that had once captivated millions betrayed her with aches and frailties. The husband who had been her anchor succumbed to illness, leaving her alone with memories. The industry that had crowned her queen found younger monarchs to worship, and though she remained alive, her life became haunted by absence of Ponti, of the roles that once defined her, of the world that once saw her as divine. And yet, even in tragedy, there is poetry. Sophia Loren, at the height of her fame, was not merely a star. She was a mirror, reflecting the desires and contradictions of her age. She proved that beauty could be strength, that vulnerability could be power, and that tragedy, when lived with grace, could be transformed into legend. At 84, her story resonates not because she fell, but because she endured, because behind the glitter of her crown was always the quiet weight of shadows. Every great love story ends, but few end so quietly, so cruelly, as the one that defined Sophia Loren's life. For more than half a century, Carlo Ponti had been her anchor, her confidant, her scandal, her salvation. He was not just her husband. He was the man who had seen her when she was still Sofia Ciccoloni, the hungry girl from Pozzuoli, with dreams larger than her fragile frame. With Carlo gone, the applause of the world felt like echoes in an empty theater. In 2007, when Ponti drew his final breath in a Swiss hospital, Sophia's world collapsed into silence. Carlo's death was not sudden. For years, his health had been declining, and Sophia lived with the daily fear that each morning might be their last together. She devoted herself to his care, retreating further from the public eye. No longer the radiant star of galas, but a wife holding vigil at her husband's side. To the outside world, this was an image of devotion, of loyalty beyond glamour. But to Sophia, it was a slow heartbreak, a countdown. She could not stop. When the inevitable finally came, she did not weep for cameras or issue grand statements. She disappeared. For months, her villa in Geneva became a mausoleum of love, each room a reminder of the man who had defined her existence. The tragedy of losing Carlo was layered. She had fought the world to be with him. She had endured exile, judgment, whispers of immorality, even the threat of imprisonment. Together, they had built a fortress of loyalty against all odds. And now, he was gone. For Sophia, it felt like fate had mocked her. After a lifetime of struggle to claim her love, she was left alone in its ashes. Friends who visited during those years recalled that her voice was softer, her laughter less frequent, her eyes perpetually moist with memory. The woman once hailed as the most beautiful in the world now carried the look of someone who had been emptied from the inside. Her sons, Carlo Jr. and Eduardo, became her lifeline. They visited, they called, they tried to fill the void, yet even they could not erase the absence of the man who had shaped their mother's entire identity. Sophia admitted in rare interviews that she felt adrift without Carlo. When you lose your partner, you lose your compass, she once confessed. The world is no longer the same color. Those words, simple yet devastating, revealed the truth. Sophia Loren, the goddess of cinema, had become a widow, haunted by the permanence of loss. Publicly, she continued to honor him. She spoke of his genius as a producer, his courage as a man who defied Catholic law to legitimize their union, his tenderness as the father of her children. But privately, She lived in mourning. She often revisited old photographs, letters, and films, immersing herself in the life they had built together. Each memory was both comfort and wound. At night, the silence of her home was deafening, broken only by the whisper of past conversations echoing in her mind. The spotlight that once illuminated her seemed now to cast only shadows. As the years passed, her reclusiveness deepened. While other stars of her era made frequent appearances on red carpets, Sophia became a phantom, surfacing only occasionally, as if testing whether the world still remembered her. When she did appear at a rare film festival or to promote her memoir, audiences gasped. Her face, lined but regal, carried the weight of decades. The beauty that had once seemed immortal was now etched with grief, transformed into something more human, more fragile. Yet even in her fragility, there remained an aura. She was still Sophia Loren, but now her legend was steeped in melancholy. Her loneliness was compounded by the reality of aging. The body that had once danced across the screen now betrayed her with aches, with fatigue, with limitations. The mirror became an adversary, reflecting not the goddess of Cannes, but the widow of Geneva. For a woman whose identity had been intertwined with beauty, this was another kind of loss, a slow erasure of the image that the world had worshipped. Sophia once admitted that she avoided mirrors, not out of vanity, but out of sorrow for the girl she could no longer see. Time, she understood, is the cruelest critic. And yet, even in her solitude, she never lost her dignity. Sophia Loren did not spiral into scandal or self-destruction, as so many stars of her era had. She chose silence over spectacle, retreat over collapse. But this choice came at a cost. It made her a ghost in the eyes of the world. Younger generations knew her name, but not her story. They saw only fragments. A photograph in a fashion magazine, a cameo on television, a fleeting headline about her reclusive life. The woman who had once defined an era was now hidden, her tragedy unfolding not in public implosions, but in private tears. The deeper heartbreak lay in the contrast. To millions, Sophia Loren remains frozen in time. The radiant 20-something draped in satin, the Oscar winner with fire in her eyes, the siren whose laughter echoed across the globe. But Sophia herself lives in the aftermath, burdened by memories, by absence, by the inevitability of mortality. The applause ended long ago, yet the silence that followed has proven louder, heavier, more suffocating than any ovation. At 84, Sophia Loren's tragedy is not that she was forgotten, nor that she was destroyed. It is that she has lived long enough to witness the fading of everything she once held dear, her husband, her youth, her stage, to outlive your love, to outlive your era, to outlive your own legend. That is the most heartbreaking fate of all. There comes a point in every star's life when the applause fades to an echo, when the cameras no longer blind with their flashes, and when the world that once demanded every piece of you moves on to someone younger, newer, brighter. For Sophia Loren, that point arrived quietly, without scandal or disgrace, but with a loneliness far more profound. At 84, she was not the tragic figure destroyed by addiction or betrayal. She was something even more haunting, a living monument to a past that the present no longer understood. Her villa in Geneva became her sanctuary and her prison. Nestled among manicured gardens and high walls, it was a place of refuge from the relentless gaze of the public. Here, Sophia lived surrounded by photographs, memorabilia, and the silent ghosts of her greatest triumphs. She cooked pasta, sauces, the recipes her mother once made in the cramped kitchen of Pozzuoli. She listened to music, mostly the Italian classics of her youth. She spent hours reading, her spectacles perched delicately on the same face that had once graced billboards around the world. From the outside, it seemed peaceful, but those who visited spoke of an undercurrent of melancholy, of a woman still mourning not only her husband, but also the stage of life she had left behind. For Sophia, aging was never simply about vanity. She had long accepted that beauty was fleeting, that the goddess in the mirror could not survive the decades untouched. What pained her was not the lines on her face, but the erasure of her presence. To be Sophia, Loren was to be adored, pursued, celebrated. To grow old as Sophia Loren was to witness the withdrawal of that adoration, to feel the silence of a phone that no longer rang with directors' offers, to see your image confined to classic cinema channels and archival montages. She once confessed that she feared irrelevance more than wrinkles. "Aging is not a crime," she said, "but being forgotten, that is the true punishment." Her sons did what they could. Carlo Jr. built his career as a conductor and pianist, while Eduardo pursued directing. They visited often, and Sophia spoke proudly of them. Yet no amount of filial devotion could replace the absence of Carlo Ponti. He had been her compass, her protector, her voice in every decision. Without him, even the company of her children felt like fragments of a life that was no longer whole. In interviews, she admitted that she sometimes still spoke to Carlo, as though he were in the next room. The house in Geneva was filled with his presence, his books, his photographs, the piano he once played. To live in that house was to live in perpetual dialogue with memory. As years passed, Sophia withdrew further from public appearances. When she did surface at a rare award ceremony, or in Hai Kong Hai Mui for her final film The Life Ahead, directed by her son Eduardo, audiences were stunned by her resilience. Though frailer, though visibly aged, her eyes still carried the fire that had once conquered Hollywood. The performance was a reminder of her depth, her raw humanity, her refusal to surrender entirely to silence. Critics hailed it as a triumphant return, but for Sophia, it was less a return than a farewell. She poured into that role the grief, the wisdom, and the loneliness of her twilight years, leaving behind one last testament to her artistry. But fame is cruelly impatient. After the brief resurgence, the silence returned. Younger audiences, enthralled by digital celebrities and fleeting trends, had little time for the legends of the past. Just in green selve the plate selve eminence, to them, Sophia Loren was a name their grandparents spoke of, a sepia-toned beauty whose relevance belonged to another century. And so, the tragedy deepened. Sophia was alive, but her legend was already being archived. She became a relic in the eyes of the world, a chapter in cinema history rather than a presence in its future. And yet, in this twilight silence, there was also resilience. Sophia never surrendered to bitterness. She did not lash out at the industry that had abandoned her, nor did she cling desperately to fame. Instead, she lived her solitude with dignity, holding fast to the truth that her legacy was already written in celluloid and memory. The tragedy was not that she had nothing left to give, but that the world no longer asked for someone who had once embodied vitality itself. That indifference was the cruelest cut. Sophia Loren's later years reveal a paradox at the heart of stardom. To be immortalized is not to be spared from mortality. It is to live long enough to become a ghost in your own lifetime. She survived the scandals, the wars, the critics, the heartbreak, but she could not escape time. Time stripped her of the man she loved, of the stage that adored her. To look at Sophia Loren, even at 84, was to look at history itself, to see in her eyes not just beauty, but survival. Her tragedy, then, is not hers alone. It is the tragedy of every icon, every human who dares to burn too brightly. The certainty that the world will one day move on, while you remain behind with your memories. For Sophia Loren, the applause has ended, but the silence tells its own story. It is the story of a woman who rose from hunger to immortality, only to learn that immortality carries its own kind of heartbreak. For decades, the world saw Sophia Loren as a living symbol of beauty, grace, and Italian cinema. Her smile was emblematic, radiant, seemingly untroubled, and forever captured on magazine covers, film reels, and public appearances. Yet behind that iconic smile, behind the glamour that dazzled millions, lay a quiet, enduring solitude. An emotional landscape shaped by love, loss, and the relentless passage of time. To look at Sophia Loren and see only the smile is to misunderstand the woman entirely, for she had known tragedy in forms far subtler than scandal, far deeper than the headlines ever suggested. Her life in Hollywood and Europe was a series of dichotomies. On one hand, there were the ovations, the awards, the eternal photographs, the applause of countless audiences. On the other, there was the private struggle to maintain dignity, the constant effort to be understood not just as a starlet or sex symbol, but as a human being with desires, fears, and grief. Sophia's charm, often mistaken for effortless joy, was in reality a carefully cultivated armor. The cameras loved her light, her radiance, her laughter. But they could not capture the nights she spent staring into the darkness of her empty bedroom, the evenings when grief for her late husband and contemplation of mortality pressed upon her chest with the weight of inevitability. In interviews over the past 2 decades, she rarely spoke of herself, and when she did, it was often with measured detachment. She reflected more on the lessons learned than on the accolades received. "I never took beauty for granted," she confessed once, "because I knew it was borrowed time. What lasts is what you leave behind in others, not the reflection you see in the mirror." That reflection, for Sophia, was a reminder of impermanence, a truth she faced daily as she grew older, and her body no longer moved with the fluid elegance of her youth. She had once danced across the screens of cinemas worldwide, capturing hearts and imaginations. Now, she walked more slowly, her steps deliberate, her presence quieter, yet infinitely more profound. Her legacy is a study in contrasts. While younger audiences may see only the films, the costumes, the elegance, those who understand the depth of her life perceive the quiet courage it took to navigate a world that commodified her beauty while demanding her compliance. She was a woman who endured exile from the Italian courts when legal restrictions threatened her marriage to Carlo Ponti. A woman who overcame poverty, a woman whose career thrived despite persistent gendered prejudices in an industry dominated by men. To speak of Sophia Loren is to speak of resilience hidden behind elegance, perseverance hidden behind laughter, and sorrow disguised beneath perfection. And yet, the loneliness that shadowed her later years was unavoidable. It was a solitude, not born of choice, but of circumstance. Loved ones passed, peers retired, the cameras ceased to follow, and the applause faded. Sophia understood that the world she had once captivated would move forward without her, as all worlds inevitably do. The tragedy of her age, therefore, was not one of failure, not of scandal, but of inevitability. To be immortalized and still human is a paradox few can endure. The world remembers you as larger than life, yet you exist in the diminishing light of ordinary reality, with all its frailties and disappointments. Her children became the conduits of her legacy, though even they could not fully encapsulate the life of a woman who had lived in Technicolor cinema while carrying the quiet sorrows of her personal world. Sophia's guidance, her wisdom, her insistence on dignity and grace were the threads she wove into their identities. She shared stories of Carlo, of her mother, of the neighborhoods of Pozzuoli, where she had grown hungry and ambitious. She passed down lessons of self-respect and determination, perhaps understanding that while the world's attention is fleeting, family and memory endure. Even as she aged, Sophia Loren remained aware of the narratives constructed around her. Paparazzi photographs, tabloid speculation, and historical retrospectives often stripped her of agency. reducing her to a symbol or anecdote, yet she did not resist history's lens. Instead, she embraced it selectively, allowing her presence in public only when it mattered, when it carried meaning. Each appearance, each interview, each written memoir was a measured contribution to the truth of her life. A truth that no camera or headline could fully capture, but that lingered for those willing to look beyond the surface. In Solitude, she also confronted the final truths that all humans must face: mortality, the impermanence of love, the passage of time, and the eventual end of one's story. To the outside observer, Sophia Loren's later life may seem serene, even privileged. But serenity is often the product of acceptance, and acceptance comes at a price. The acknowledgement that glory is temporal, that beauty is fleeting, and that all the love in the world cannot reclaim the past. Her tragedy is therefore not in the loss of opportunity, wealth, or fame. It is in the quiet understanding that the years one cherishes most will never return, and that even the brightest life can only be measured in memories and impressions left behind. Yet, within this tragic reflection, there is also grace. Sophia Loren's life offers a meditation on the complexity of human existence, on the simultaneous capacity for joy and sorrow, love and loss, triumph and retreat. Her smile, iconic and enduring, is a testament not to the absence of grief, but to the presence of courage. It is the smile of a woman who has loved profoundly, suffered privately, and survived with dignity intact. In that, she offers an unspoken lesson, that even in tragedy there is strength, even in silence there is meaning, and even in the fading of time there is legacy. As Sophia Loren continues her days in the quiet of Geneva, the world outside remains captivated by her mythos, unaware of the full weight of her experiences. Her films are watched, studied, revered, but they tell only part of her story. The greater story, the one of a woman navigating immense success while weathering profound loneliness and the inexorable march of time, is known to few. And perhaps that is fitting. Perhaps it is within the quiet, unobserved moments that true lives are measured. Far from the cameras and applause, where the human heart confronts its most intimate truths. Sophia Loren's tragedy is a reminder that even the brightest stars must eventually face the darkened stage, that every legacy carries both triumph and sorrow, and that the measure of a life is not solely in its public accolades, but in its private endurance. In her eyes, one can see the full spectrum of human experience: joy tempered by grief, love shadowed by loss, and a beauty that is more than skin-deep, forged from resilience, courage, and the enduring pursuit of authenticity. The final curtain falls for every life, regardless of fame, fortune, or brilliance. For Sophia Loren, it was not a dramatic collapse into scandal or despair, but a quiet, inevitable descent into the solitude of twilight. The cameras no longer followed her every step. The magazines no longer clamored for her image, and the glittering invitations that once defined her existence had long ceased. And yet, it is precisely in this absence of spectacle that her true story is revealed, in the silence between the flashes of memory and the shadows of a life meticulously lived. Her last years were spent in contemplation, in revisiting the landscapes of her past, both physically and emotionally. She returned, often in private, to the streets of Pozzuoli where she had grown up, walking past the familiar stone walls and narrow alleys that had shaped her earliest experiences. These journeys were not pilgrimages of nostalgia alone. They were acts of reclamation. Each step was a reminder that she had emerged from poverty and struggle not merely to survive, but to triumph, to imprint upon the world a beauty and talent that defied circumstance. She carried with her the weight of memory, of a life lived at full intensity, and yet, with the serenity that comes from acceptance. Sophia's legacy, however, is not found merely in the streets of her youth or the awards that grace her shelves. It is etched into the films themselves, the performances where laughter mingled with tears, where passion intertwined with heartbreak. In Two Women, she bore the horrors of war with an authenticity that won her the Academy Award, a testament not only to her skill, but to her capacity to channel personal understanding into art. In Marriage Italian Style, she captured the complexity of love, desire, and resilience, reminding audiences that women could be both sensual and intelligent, defiant and tender. Each role was more than entertainment. It was an articulation of human truth, and in those portrayals, Sophia Loren's real self is immortalized, far beyond the ephemeral attention of contemporary celebrity. Yet, the tragedy of her final years lies not in her accomplishments, but in the isolation that accompanied them. Time, inexorable and impartial, had removed many who had shared her journey. Carlo Ponti, the steadfast partner whose death left a silence she could never fully fill, friends whose conversations had once brightened evenings, and an industry that no longer found novelty in her presence. To the world, she remained the embodiment of elegance and poise, but within the walls of her villa in Geneva, she wrestled with the subtle grief of obsolescence. This is a truth that many legends confront, but few acknowledge: the sensation of being alive while simultaneously being forgotten by the present. Sophia, however, confronted this paradox with grace. She did not cling desperately to the spotlight, nor did she succumb to bitterness. Instead, she embraced her circumstances, understanding that the value of her life was not measured by ongoing public recognition, but by the enduring resonance of her work and the lives she had touched. She devoted her remaining energy to family, to introspection, and to the careful curation of her legacy. She mentored younger actors, imparting lessons about authenticity, perseverance, and dignity. She gave interviews selectively, ensuring that each one conveyed the measured wisdom of experience rather than the hollow glamour of vanity. In these gestures, she quietly reaffirmed the truth that legacy is constructed not by the applause of the moment, but by the enduring influence one leaves behind. In Solitude, she also reflected on the nature of her own identity. Sophia Loren, the woman, had always been distinct from Sophia Loren, the icon. The public adored a carefully framed image, a synthesis of talent and allure. Yet the woman behind that image experienced the full spectrum of human emotion: fear, loss, hope, joy, and sorrow. In acknowledging this duality, she found a measure of peace. She understood that her celebrity would endure as a symbol, but her personal truth, the woman who had faced hunger, insecurity, societal prejudice, and grief, was hers alone, intimate and unreplicable. And in that recognition lay both the poignancy and the power of her story. Sophia Loren's life illustrates a fundamental truth about existence. The most profound human experiences often unfold beyond public scrutiny. Fame amplifies achievement, but does not shield one from the subtleties of suffering. Success does not immunize against loneliness, nor does adoration erase the passage of time. Sophia's final years, though quiet, were rich with introspection, a testament to her resilience, intelligence, and unyielding spirit. She had lived fully, loved deeply, and endured with dignity, a legacy more remarkable than any headline could ever convey. As her days waned, she contemplated mortality with an awareness both humbling and courageous. She understood that her story would outlive her, that her image would remain in films, photographs, and memories, even as her physical presence faded. She reflected on the paradox of immortality: to be remembered as eternal in public perception, yet to confront the finitude of one's own existence in private. This duality, rather than breaking her spirit, imbued her final years with a solemn dignity. She became a quiet witness to the passage of time, a custodian of her own history, and a symbol of endurance for those who understood that true strength is often invisible. Sophia Loren's tragedy, therefore, is both ordinary and extraordinary. It is ordinary in the sense that all humans must face the erosion of time, the loss of loved ones, and the inevitability of silence. It is extraordinary because she lived a life so public, so luminous, that her private mourning was rendered invisible to most. The world celebrates her smile, her poise, her cinematic triumphs, yet rarely recognizes the courage it took to carry that smile through decades of personal sorrow, public expectation, and the relentless march of mortality. In this lies the profound heartbreak. To have conquered the world and yet be intimately familiar with its indifference, to have given everything and still encounter the silence of life's ultimate impartiality. And yet, even in the face of such tragedy, there is redemption. Sophia Loren's life, complete with its triumphs and sorrows, stands as a testament to human resilience and grace. Her story reminds us that legacy is not solely the product of fame or fortune, but of character, perseverance, and the quiet, unrecorded choices that define our humanity. She endured hunger, adversity, loss, and loneliness, yet she remained dignified, generous, and authentically herself until the very end. The final curtain, when it eventually falls, is inevitable. But Sophia Loren's story teaches that the way one bows, the manner in which one leaves the stage, and the echoes one leaves behind define more than the applause ever could. Her life is a study in endurance, a chronicle of grace under pressure, and a reflection on the subtle tragedies that accompany even the most luminous existence. In the end, the world may remember her as a legend, a beauty, an icon of cinema, but those who look closer see the truth beneath the smile. A woman who lived fiercely, loved profoundly, and met the silence of time with unmatched dignity.